All right. Well, I appreciate everybody being here today. I know that a lot of you may be just learning about ACT, but the fact that you're here today shows that you, despite, a lot of changes that are happening across the globe, like you're working towards your own values and motivation just by showing up and wanting to learn. So I think that's really great. And you're allowing me a space to work towards my own values, which is super cool. This presentation today is really just an introduction of ACT for behavior analysts. So a lot of what I'm going to do is just kind of break down the hexaflex and the terms that are commonly used in the ACT literature from a behavior analytics standpoint, and then make some applications to parent training. If I have enough time, I have some specific applications from some literature I've recently read about applying ACT via telehealth and within, during the COVID-19 crisis, which I think would be really relevant for everybody right now, but it really depends on how quickly I get through the materials. So to begin, I want to lay down a little bit of foundational information about ACT and how it relates to ABA. And in fact, ACT relies on very similar foundational knowledge that started with Skinner and early applied behavior analysis. For example, it relies on I wouldn't say assumption, but the research and literature that behavior is operant. That's including both private and public behaviors, right? So not just what we do that's measurable and observable, but as well as our thoughts and emotions and the rules that we make privately about our world. And the second thing really interesting about human behavior is that, we are different in the sense that we can make rules that can help us to learn without really having to come into contact with contingencies. And that's something that we all understand as behavior analysts. We use rule governed behavior to help our kids actually having to come into contact with those aversive lessons. Or for example, with the stoplight picture here, we don't need to cross a red light and get a ticket in order to stop at a red light, which is, something really about humans. However, ACT is kind of based on our tendency to construct these rules about ourselves and our environment, and how this can often lead to narrow and unworkable behaviors that are often based on negative reinforcement. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I know that there's not a lot of text on these slides, and that's because normally I give this presentation in person. So if someone has a question, they usually just shoot their hand up. So turn your mic on, jump in if you need to. That's totally fine with me. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things that led to the development of the hexaflex, or that the components of ACT are trying to work through. And one of the things is cognitive fusion. So cognitive fusion is really just instances when a person takes thoughts or the rules that they develop too literally. For example, you might imagine a parent who thinks, I'm a bad parent every time their child acts out in public. Well, if they're taking those thoughts literally, then they might avoid public outings in the future because they don't want to come into contact with those aversive thoughts. And you get that negative reinforcement, right? Because you've avoided putting yourself into a difficult situation. I actually wanted to bring up an example about myself right now so that maybe we could relate as behavior analysts, because our behavior is super important as well when we're considering ACT and then what we do with our clients. So an example that I have is maybe I noticed times when there's a complex procedure that could be really efficient and beneficial for one of my clients, but I might avoid it. So for example, tolerance training is something that I'm really interested in and have learned a lot about recently. But when I first started learning about it, I felt like it's pretty daunting, right? And so when I had a case where a client could really benefit from the tolerance training, I noticed myself looking for different procedures. Like, could I just do DRA or DRO? Could I find something that's like a little less complicated? But essentially, I'm fusing with a thought behind all of this, which was, I'm not smart enough to do this, and I just can't take this on right now. And so when you fuse with those thoughts and emotions, then you engage in what we call experiential avoidance, which is what I was doing. I was looking at other procedures in a way to rectify the situation without actually having to come into contact with anything aversive or explore something that seemed difficult. So experiential avoidance is essentially, those are behaviors that attempt to avoid or terminate aversive private events. So for example, I brought up the bad parent who avoids situations that might be difficult with their child, or my avoidance behavior initially around tolerance training. As you can see in the slide, the main character, he's debating whether or not he wants to talk to his friend Yolanda. But then he wants to avoid maybe that situation because it might be aversive if he opens up that conversation. And then at the end of the comic strip, he says, he who, I can't actually see it, but essentially he's saying that, you know, I'm suffering already by having this internal battle with myself and by avoiding things, that I might as well eventually just talk to her. And I think that's actually a really good picture of what experiential avoidance is like. Essentially, the more and more you avoid something, you are getting that short negative reinforcement, but you're not actually getting rid of those negative thought patterns, or those unworkable behaviors aren't actually helping you towards anything. Does anybody have questions about cognitive fusion and experiential avoidance before we talk about the hexaflex? Okay. All right. Just so you guys know, I'm kind of new to Zoom, so if you're chatting, I'm probably not seeing it. So I just need you to speak up. Okay, so this is the hexaflex, and probably you guys by now have heard a little bit about what the hexaflex is or different components of the hexaflex, just because I think at this point ACT has been around in the ABA world long enough. But essentially, each component of the hexaflex is designed to build what they call psychological flexibility and directly build skills to manage our tendency to engage in those experiential avoidance and cognitive fusion behaviors. So all of these components really do work together and build upon one another. And I just go through and talk about each component, and hopefully that will give you a better understanding of what they are and how you could use them in practice. So first we'll talk about present moment. Essentially, present moment engagement, or what I call
I was gonna say, is everybody else, is it frozen for everybody else? Okay. Hang on 1 second, we'll see if, let's see if she comes back. While we're waiting, just so I know, how many of you are familiar with ACT, or like let's say on a scale of 1 to 5, who, like, where's your comfort level with ACT? 5 being like the most.
0.
Okay. So we got a good range here. Just realized my camera was off. Oh. Becky, why do you think that is? While we're waiting, you can turn that on, because we talk about
what was your question?
Oh, I was asking Becky. Becky said that she was experiencing.
Becky. I thought you said Beth McKee. Sorry.
Hey Beth, I'd love to talk to you too. Like,
So I was at the same boot camp that Sky just mentioned, and I've been doing, a 16-hour ACT CEU, and I've really been diving into it. But I think maybe it's just my perfectionism and feeling like I'm not good enough to do something that I don't know completely, and it scares me to think about going to a client who's relying on me to know what I'm doing and not know what I'm doing. So I'm doing baby steps.
Okay, that's fair enough. I think this is a good place to talk about stuff like that. Is that, like, what are the hangups? Where are you, like? So we talk about like identifying thoughts that you're having. So in ACT, we talk about your behavior being under the control of your private verbal behavior or direct acting contingencies in your environment, right? And so thinking about that, like, what is controlling your behavior right now? And it sounds like a lot of the experiential avoidance. But no, I think this is a perfect, maybe to start recognizing some of those specific thoughts that come up. Oftentimes I think a lot of behavior analysts shy away from ACT because it sounds too woo-woo, and it sounds, you're talking about thoughts and feelings and all kinds of stuff. And they're like, no, I can't touch that. But I think that's actually beneficial for us to be able to talk in those terms. But did I see you at the boot camp? I feel like I did.
Yes, we had lunch together.
Yes, that's right. Okay, thank you. I was like, yes, at BurgerFi. I was like, all right, yes. No, and then there was like the meetup that we had, and Sky just said, I gave a sticker. Yeah, I was handing out stickers there and everything. So yeah, I was at the Florida Fort Lauderdale boot camp. So I'm not sure what happened to Chelsea. Let me check my email. I don't know if any of you have been experiencing this. I'm so lucky that we have not yet, but like Zoom being overloaded, or people's internet's being overloaded depending on where they live, just by the amount of people using that and not being able to keep up with the bandwidth and all of that. So I'm really hoping that nothing like serious has happened. Okay, so she said she got disconnected.
Erin, I'd be happy to say a little bit about what I've been doing with ACT and parent training.
Be great.
I was the person at the boot camp that said I wanted to do parent coaching, but I didn't want to tell the parents what it was called because I was afraid they wouldn't want to come if they thought I was doing ACT on them.
Right.
And I think the advice I got was just not to tell them, which I didn't. I didn't call it ACT. I just said, we're going to do parent training and I'm going to talk to you about some things. I essentially called it parent self-regulation. That is the language that I used. And I talked about both sides of the equation. We worked on some kid skills and we worked on some parent skills. And then by the end of it, I introduced the ACT hexaflex and I talked more about the language, but I did it in a slow way. It was terrifying for me to delve into that and to practice some of the use of the ACT activities and the metaphors. The way that I managed that was I practiced a lot at home. I used my family. I did it myself. I tried things out quite a bit on my husband and my children, and I asked them, "How did that feel? How did that work for you?" They were my guinea pigs, and then I tried it out in my groups, and it was still hard. But just doing it, really just doing it and trying it out. And it actually went really well. I ran a 12-week group from January to March. And I feel like those parents coming into the COVID crisis, out of all my families, the ones who were in the group, I had 7 families, have been the ones to cope most effectively. I'm absolutely convinced.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There's a couple comments going on in the chat about Dr. Gould's program. So Evelyn Gould, which I know is part of what Chelsea's going to talk about in this PowerPoint, is the parent training, like ACT for parent training. Did you use any of that, or?
I didn't have anything formal. I was doing I work with 5 and under. I was doing the Early Start Denver model coaching, and I implemented each day some aspect of the ACT training. I didn't have a formal model for it.
Yeah, I like that. advice to not, like, you don't always have to label what you're doing. You know, it's like if you were going to praise a parent, would you say, okay, I'm going to provide you social positive reinforcement right now, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, you know? And so I think it just becomes, when it becomes fluent, it becomes natural, it just becomes a part of what you do. And I think just baby steps, you said using it on your family, using it on your kids, whatever that was. For me, it was using it on myself. And I know there's a couple people in this group too that would probably agree with me, is that to be able to become fluent with certain things, whether it's like the metaphors, whether it's the just identifying your own values and how beneficial that can be. So for those of you who are really struggling, at least my advice would be to start doing it yourself. There's also a very good book. I'm looking to see if it's on the bookshelf. I think it might be downstairs, that Lisa Coyne just put out on parents and ACT, and it is phenomenal, like absolutely phenomenal. I'll have to find that. Yes, there, I think, no, that's The Joy of Parenting, which is also really, really good. There's a different one. I'll have to find out. I know that Chelsea's emailing me and saying like her internet just went down. She's trying to reset it and everything. So hopefully everything is okay. But yeah, Sky, I really like that you said like the groups and things like that too. I always found that very tangible things with parents or with myself are the easiest place to go to. So it's okay, let's identify what values are, you know, like, and for me, that was like being able to attach things back to that. It's like, all right, is my behavior in alignment with this value or not? Or what value am I working towards right now? Or like I talk about all the time, Kristen and I, as like a couple, we identified like core values together. So like if you're struggling in your marriage, it's like, what are your core values of your relationship? And so when things start to unravel to whatever that looks like, it's like, go back and like, what value, we're able to easily say, okay, we haven't had this, we're not meeting this, we're not meeting this. And everything is skewed towards this over here. And so you start to sprinkle in those other things. And so I think that happens a lot of times with parents too, is that they are so focused on meeting the needs of their child that they forget to meet all of these other things that can be valuable, that are values, you know, in their life, or things that they find important to them. So I've got to find the name of that book.
Hey, I'm back.
Yes, there you are.
Sorry about that, guys. Little known fact about Oregon is that the internet people are the worst, and this happens like a few times a day. So I think I'm just not used to having to use my internet at home. So thanks for hanging there with me.
All good. We were just talking about maybe some questions that they would want to bring up later, as far as
Awesome.
struggles about getting into parenthood, like where do you start? So I will have them chime in.
Awesome. And I have some resources for that at the end of my presentation too. So would love to talk about that actually. Let me just reshare my screen with you guys.
And just so you know, I had referenced the book and Angela just put it in the chat box. So Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, the Clinician's Guide to Supporting Parents. So I don't know if you had planned on suggesting that, but that is an excellent book.
That's great. Cool. Awesome. No, I hadn't recommended that or thought about it. So very good. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off, shall we? So present moment. This is essentially, like I said before, it's intended to reduce that insensitivity to what's happening currently due to our tendency to form a lot of rules about ourselves and our environment. A really good example of this might be if a parent is too busy wrapped up in their thoughts about what's happening next, like, okay, I need to get home, I need to cook dinner, I need to make sure my child does their homework, then they might be missing that for the first time their child is walking appropriately with them down the sidewalk. Another example of this might be, again, relating to my own experience with tolerance training, for example. You know, if I'm attending to the present moment, I'm going to be able to read the literature without looking through the lens of my negative thoughts about it. So if I'm wrapped up thinking about how this is so hard, I'm not ready for this, I'm not equipped, I can't, you know, I'm too stupid, then when I'm reading the literature, I'm going to be kind of my motivation's not going to be there, and it's going to be seen more as something punishing and aversive, versus if I accept that my thoughts are going to be there, but I'm really just trying to get the most out of that literature review or whatever kind of research I'm looking into, then I might actually learn something. You could also think of a student who I work, and previously I worked with children with severe aggression and problem behaviors, and some of the kiddos were really benefiting from ACT at some point because they were, kind of wrapped up in the thought during their classroom, like, I'm too stupid for this. This is too hard anyways. I'm just going to give up. If I throw this pencil, then they'll give me a break. So essentially, they're wrapped up in their thoughts, and they're already, leaning into the rules that they've made about themselves instead of just listening to the material. And it could turn out that they actually like what the teacher is presenting to them. So that's kind of what present moment attending is all about. It's really to disrupt your tendency to engage in thoughts about the past or the future, or being kind of playing like tennis with your negative thoughts about yourself. So that's something that is essential to ACT, I think. Normally, if I were doing this presentation in person, I'd have an activity for us to do, but I have a homework assignment for you. And this is something you could try on yourself and then later have like a loved one, or if you are doing telehealth right now, you could have one of your clients, if it's beneficial, or a parent. This would be great for a parent to try at home. So essentially what you do is you need to get a small edible item of your choice. Usually I pass out Hershey's Kisses because that's, something that usually everyone can get into, and they're small enough. And what you do, you can ask the parent to do this, or you can try it yourself first. It's probably easier if you lead the parent through it. So you have the parent take a bite of the Hershey's Kiss or whatever item they've chosen, and you tell them to savor this item and notice its texture and taste, and really imagine that this might be the last time they're ever eating that kind of chocolate, and have them just really be present with that chocolate eating experience. Once they've finished consuming the bite that they've had, have them take another bite, and then start to kind of gently stress them out. So you can start to then feed them some thoughts that they might normally be engaging in, like, okay, so now when you take this bite, I want you to think about all the work you're going to have to do to keep your kid busy the rest of the day. And are you managing the token economy right? How are things going with work? I bet work is like really hard right now because you're having to work from home, and probably after this you have all these emails to answer. Kind of giving them an idea of what normally you might imagine they're thinking about. After that, you just kind of have them notice the difference. So you can ask them, when you took the first bite, what was that like for you? And what was the second bite like? Pretty much I've done this at conferences. I do this with parents. I've done it with kids in my kids groups, and even the teens in my teen ACT group. And I'd say 90% of the time people say, well, in the second time, I didn't even really taste the chocolate. It just kind of dissolved really quickly, and I didn't even get anything out of it. So personally, I think this is a very easy introduction to the benefits of present moment engagement, and I highly recommend you try it out. I think it really proves how different your experience of the world can be when you're not engaging constantly with your thoughts. So the second part of the hexaflex is self as context. And, I hesitate to say this, but a lot of people say that this can be confusing for especially behavior analysts. The reason I hesitate is because when I say it's confusing, then it almost gives you an SD to avoid learning more, right? If I say, oh, this is confusing, then you've created the rule. Behavior analysts think it's confusing, therefore I might find this confusing and I'm not going to put so much effort into it. And I think that's not really true. And in fact, I think right now is such a prime example of us managing self as context, especially parents. So personally, I'm finding, well, let me back up and explain what self as context is. It really has to do with what relational frame theory calls dictic relations. All that means is a fancy way of saying I here now versus me there then, or you there then. It's a lot about the rules and the relations we place on ourselves in different contexts and times. So for example, I equal behavior analyst, I equal, you know, a friend, a roommate, a partner. And what can be damaging about this is that we often tend to make really rigid rules about who we are. And sometimes those rules become very narrow, and that can be harmful for us. And I think right now is a perfect example of that. And maybe it's just me that's kind of going through this self as context discovery moment. But my clinic closed probably 3 weeks ago due to the COVID outbreak. And I think it was a good decision on their part because we wanted to keep everyone safe. However, I will say that that combined with my climbing gym closing, I have had a real struggle with what rules I'm going to make about myself now, because everything that I knew to be me was suddenly kind of cut loose. And at first I felt like there was a lot of suffering in the sense that I had a lot more private events happening around that. Like, oh, I'm so lost. Like, who even am I? What am I supposed to do now? Luckily, I've turned it into a place of discovery, and I'm learning different ways to reach my values, like this presentation today, or exploring, you know, playing guitar and like learning new ways to exercise. So I hope that's a good example of self as context for you guys. Essentially, again, it's just the rules we make about ourselves in different contexts. I think parents are also learning now, like, now I'm a teacher, now I'm someone who works remotely, now I'm someone who doesn't have any free time. So that might be something you keep in mind when you're navigating parent training right now. The next part of the hexaflex I want to talk about is values. And Hayes defines values as verbal statements that alter the degree to which consequences function as reinforcers or punishers. So what does that sound like to you guys? It's essentially an EO, right? If you take the definition of a motivating operator or an EO, the same definition is almost there in the texts. So you can really think about values as EOs. They are what motivate us. They're the rules that we create about how we want to be. And if we create our own healthy rules to follow, then that can kind of help us navigate some of the aversive parts of working towards those values. So it's essentially you're establishing a delayed long-term reinforcer in order to help combat those motivations to engage in negative avoidant behaviors. If you think about it this way, let's think about the classic example of a parent who's going through helping their child through an extinction burst. If the parent knows that the extinction burst is part of the process and that it means that it's working, then they might be able to understand when they're at the grocery store and their child's having a meltdown and everybody's looking at them and they're thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, I feel like a bad parent right now, but my BCBA told me that I should expect this to happen and that this means that it's working. And that means that I'm helping my child be independent, which is one of my values. Okay, I can do this, it's working. I'm being a good parent. So it's basically allowing you to be able to withstand the aversiveness of some of the difficulties. Like myself and my value to be a good provider, like, yes, tolerance training is complicated and hard, but I also know it's definitely the best thing for a lot of my clients. So because best practice and doing and helping people is a really strong value of mine, I'm going to dig into the research and I'm going to learn about it and I'm going to put some procedures in place. And those private events, be damned, right? Like, it's fine. I can handle that because something bigger is more important to me. So next we'll talk about diffusion. Its aim is to reduce cognitive fusion by disrupting those narrow, rigid functions that our thoughts traditionally serve. We want to have a broad, flexible repertoire of responding to our thoughts. If we see our thoughts as stimuli that are occurring in response to contingencies in the environment, we can see things as a lot more workable. So, for example, if you think about this thought of a parent, I'm a bad parent, there's not much you can do with that, right? You've established a rule and that's it. You're a bad parent. Okay. But if the parent is able to say, oh, I'm having the thought that I'm a bad parent because my child's acting up and people are looking at me, and that makes me feel like a bad parent. That thought is a lot more workable, right? You could take that, I'm having the thought that, and you could say, but my value is to help my child be independent. It's a lot more workable. There's a lot more space for moving forward. An example of a diffusion exercise that I learned from the Acting Context podcasts, which I highly recommend if you're open to exploring ACT applied in more of a mental health realm. There's some really great exercises that you can get out of it. It's a really good resource. But they talk about I can't remember who it was who they interviewed, but he was talking about how he catches himself while he's driving home. And you probably experienced this too, where you're driving and suddenly your thoughts just start like berating you, right? And it's like, oh, you didn't respond to this email. Oh, when you looked at that person, you said it kind of weird. I wonder if they're thinking about you. Ah, man, you're going to have like, you were kind of mean to that person, or you should have said it differently. What he says was that he'd say, oh, I guess I'm tuned into crazy FM. And I think the idea, I don't know about the word verbiage, but I think the idea in and of itself of just noticing like, oh, let's take a step back here. I'm just getting wrapped up in my thoughts. That's a really good way to notice that you can take space from that. Another exercise that you could try at home would be the classic milk, milk, milk exercise, which it's basically you repeat the word milk like 15 times and notice kind of what milk that word does for you. If we have time at the end of this, we can totally try it. Usually you start with milk and then you might think about a thought that's actually bothering you. So like maybe the thought that I was struggling with last week was, I don't know who I am. So I could say like, who am I 15 times? And it might not have any relevancy to me, or I might even find myself laughing as I say it because the function has been changed. And I've just gotten so much space from the word that I realize that's just a word. It doesn't have to hold meaning over me. So that's something, if we have time, we can totally try it. If not, I definitely recommend you try it at home. The next part of the hexaflex is something that I think behavior analysts have a really good time digging into. And actually, I have to say that I think that this can make us really excellent clinicians because we do focus so much on actually getting some tangible outcomes from what we do. That's kind of like 99% of our focus. And if we can learn more about ACT and the private events that we're also wanting to navigate, we could be really, really strong clinicians. I think this is what makes us strong because, and I'm not trying to say that mental health is worse or different, but I think the difference is that there's a lot of sitting and talking and working through those metaphors, but there's not as much of an emphasis traditionally on actually having those behaviors generalize outside and like seeing some of those behaviors take place. So essentially all committed actions means is that's those public behaviors. That's the overt behavior change towards valued ends. So you give a parent, you find out what the parent's values are. Those are their EOs. You use those EOs to develop parent training targets, and then you help them decide on some committed actions, which are essentially the targets that you could put in place for them. Committed actions are basically our bread and butter. So for example, myself as a BCBA, if I value quality care, then I'm going to be doing those LET reviews. I'm going to be seeking support from people who know tolerance training better than me and getting some training from them. and learning how to put those procedures in place, those are all my committed actions. Like I said at the beginning of this presentation, you worked towards your values by showing up today. There's something about being here that brought you here, right? It's probably because you're wanting to learn more, and that's a beautiful value. And your committed action was signing in and registering, and also hanging in there when my internet went out on us. All right, so that's committed actions. I am going to talk about applications to parent training, but I want to hold on for a second if you guys do have any quick questions about the hexaflex.
I
Okay.
didn't see any pop up in there, but I did want to make a comment. I think the self is, well, actually I did with the self as content or self as context, whichever.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's by far one of the hardest ones for people to understand. And I don't know if there are any specific questions as far as clarification, but for those of you who might not be understanding that one, just like hold that lightly, because it's not easy. You know, that's the tough one for me, at least.
Yeah, and I would be happy to talk about that afterwards too, because I think that we make more out of it than it really is. It's really just like I at home am a partner and a roommate. I at work equal professional, behavior analyst, smart person. And when, let's say at work, I come into contact with something that doesn't make me feel smart, like tolerance training, then that is painful for me to experience. And then I might avoid even reaching out for help because I don't want someone to see me as stupid, right? So that's how self as context can be damaging, because I have this big rule about myself that I need to be a smart professional behavior analyst, but I need to actually learn something, and that makes me feel kind of stupid. So that's kind of where that pain and aversiveness comes from. Again, we can talk about that later during the discussion, but I think it's super relevant and salient right now, like more than ever, actually.
I have a good example that I'll bring up.
Perfect.
There. But
awesome.
I want to make sure everybody hears this part though. So.
Okay, cool. So when I talk about applications to parent training, I'm going to kind of briefly touch on, well, more than briefly, I'm going to try to go a little quickly because there's a lot I want to talk about. But Evelyn Gould has a really great article she put out in 2018. And then I want to talk about some extensions to right now and some resources that I've discovered through ACT for ABA practitioners. They have this awesome Dropbox. If you are not a member and you're interested in learning more, definitely join their Facebook page, because they have this Dropbox just full of really great resources from awesome people like Tarbox, Evelyn Gould, Steve Hayes, etc. All right, so I want to first talk about Gould's 2018 article, which evaluated the effects of ACT on overt behavior of parents of children with autism. The purpose was to see if ACT could be a good way to get some overt behavior change, also to obviously always contribute to the literature, and see if this was even something feasible that people could be implementing, especially within the context of they're doing in-home therapy. So these sessions were conducted in home. The person who came in and to do those one-to-one sessions was the ACT trainer. And the sessions were once a week for 1.5 hours, and they just had one session per week. This was what they were measuring. So frequency of values-directed parent behaviors. Again, values-directed behavior is any action resulting in a tangible outcome directly related to the parent value. A parent value is a verbally constructed reinforcer or rule that basically is an EO. They also use self-monitoring data collected outside of training sessions as IOA. I know I actually chatted with Evelyn Gould about this recently, and she was saying what they did was they would send pictures of themselves going out. So if one of the parents' values was autonomy or like having time to themselves, then they would send pictures of themselves on a date night and be like, look, we're working towards our value. We got a babysitter. We went to a play, or we went out to dinner. And so that was another way of collecting IOA and through permanent product data and verification from other people. Here's an example, and I think this could really help you guys because it really shows kind of that like funnel approach, right? So they did a values assessment, which I think I know which procedure they used, and I'll show you after this. But they essentially gauged what the parents' values are. They found that Sarah valued child autonomy. And then, this is beautiful, they operationally defined child autonomy. So they took like a really broad thing such as a value, which sounds difficult for us to wrap our minds around as behavior analysts, but then turned it into something very measurable. Any instance of child engaging in an activity independently outside of the home. And then they worked with the parent to gather some examples. So going to different aisles in the market, using a restroom, waiting in line independently, going to a friend's house, all of these things without supervision. This is the design. They used non-concurrent multiple baseline. There was baseline, then training, post-training, and follow-up. And there were 6 weeks, so 6 ACT sessions, and they were all kind of individualized to the parents, but really followed a general ACT protocol. And if you look at the intervention, I think this is really a good example too of how ACT and ABA really make like even better outcomes than either one on their own. So experiential exercises are basically ACT exercises. It's just the same, it's just the wordage that they use for those experiential activities. But then they also use what really looks like BST, right? Role playing, modeling, skill demonstration, lecture, and discussion. They do a review of the parent value of each previous week, and then they talk about ways to practice it. And then they would remind the parent, remember your value, remember you said you'd walk down the grocery store aisle. These email handouts is like between session prompts. And these are the results. So overall, you see in the post-training for sure that there's increased frequencies of those values-directed actions. And what's really interesting is in follow-up, it's even higher for 2 out of the 3. I do find it, and I'm still curious about what happened with Sarah during training, but there was a little bit of reluctance for that, those committed actions during training. However, again, I feel like there's still a lot of strong data to show that like the maintenance of this approach is really strong. So essentially, this showed that ACT can produce meaningful changes in parent behavior, and the values-directed behaviors were maintained and actually strengthened in follow-up. This was one of the first studies that attempted to directly measure the effects of ACT on parent training behavior, and it supports previous literature. There were some limitations, however. The data collection and measurement was difficult because it was parent report, and we know that reporting is not nearly as strong a data as seeing it for yourself, but it's also kind of really, I think that's where ACT and ABA are definitely, that's our new frontier, is the data collection part. There was kind of lack of data confirming the application or generalizability. Also, I think if somebody's looking to do a study, or you're a PhD student or you're considering it, I think a component analysis would be super cool to do as an extension of this, to see what part of the treatment package was most effective, or if you really need the whole thing, as well as lack of treatment integrity data. So there's definitely stuff to be worked on, but I'm so glad that we have the literature starting so that we can build upon it and add to the literature and make it even stronger. So in conclusion, parents are obviously critical in ensuring best outcomes for our clients. And we know that parent psychological distress is super high in children, parents of children with special needs. It's higher than any other population, actually. And they need support. And by capitalizing on their values, we are able to actually make that change and help them manage their stress in a way that's meaningful and sets it up for lasting change. So I wanted to share with you guys this exercise because I think this might actually help you to understand where do I get started. So this is something that Evelyn Gould had shared on the Dropbox like a year ago maybe, and she got it from a different ACT clinician that she's been using herself. Evelyn has been using it for parent training, and I started to do the same thing upon intake, or like 6-month re-auth, just to kind of reassess where the parents were at. And I'll show it to you now. It's very simple. Basically, when you sit down with a parent and you're trying to look at parent training goals, what I want you to consider asking is, what are 3 wishes you have for your child? And I've had a couple parents especially who have been in ABA for a long time, they're just not used to such a broad question. So they might say something like, I don't know what you want me to say. In which case I'll just say, tell me what a perfect day for your child would look like. If you had like in your head what his beautiful, most perfect day would be like, what would it be for him? And usually that's when you start to get some ideas. The parents often say things along the lines of, I just want him to be able to make friends. I just want him to be able to notice when he's being bullied, or I want him to be able to be happy and have fun at school. So you can record those, but I'm imagining in your head right now that you're already thinking about some targets that you could put in place based off of those statements. As well as, what wishes do you have for yourself as a parent? This question, it seems to set parents back a bit, and it makes me wonder if we just don't think about our parents enough as humans. And this question has helped me a lot to understand that I need to give them goals to actually help them manage their own stress. Because often they say, I just wish that I could go out on a date night, or I wish that I could have a drink with my friends. I haven't gone out with my friends in years, or go see a movie. So that gives me a lot of ideas about maybe some self-care goals that I need to be thinking about for parents as well. Because if they're taking care of themselves, they're going to be able to take care of their child, which is my client, right? What are 3 wishes you have for your family? So if you could have a perfect day as a family, what would that look like? Often I get responses around like, I'd love it if we could just go somewhere without so much stress, without worrying about problem behavior, without worrying about whether or not I brought all the token stuff or the reinforcers, etc. And I guarantee that you can glean from this some really interesting parent training goals. And I think what's really essential about this, or at least in my own experience that I've noticed, that instead of me going in there and saying, here's what I think we should work on, I'm talking to the parents and I'm assessing what their EOs are. And then I'm making my goals based off of that. And so it makes them feel heard, I think. And it makes them feel like they're collaborating with me in this process, rather than me just kind of telling them and presenting them with demand, right? So I think it really changes the function of the whole parent training setting. So I don't know where we're at on time. Let me see. We're okay, right, Erin?
Yeah, you got like 8 minutes, but and people can go if they want to, but
Okay.
we can hang out. I mean, I'm good for another 15 minutes afterwards if people want to stay and have more discussion. But also too, there's a question about the passwords, because I think the internet drop kind of threw us off. It's okay. Right. I've been like collecting some easy quiz questions that people can answer. So like a component of the hexaflex and an exercise you can use with parents, like we just talked about. So don't worry about the passwords.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thanks, guys. Okay, so I'll go quickly. I know that this is something we're all navigating right now, and it felt too important to not talk about. So something I thought about was, we're all probably doing some telehealth or moving to there. And we know that parents are dealing with so much more stress than ever. Like I said, self is context. Now they're dealing with new rules about themselves. Like now I'm a stay-at-home parent, and I have to be an educator, and I have to be their primary therapist, and I have to be an employee still, but learn to work remotely. And I still have to be a partner if they are with somebody, which is challenging. It's just a ton of new rules that they have to get comfortable with. And I can't even imagine. I mean, I don't have children personally, and I'm struggling on my own as it is. So I just have a lot of empathy and compassion for our families right now. So you might modify the 3 wishes and just see what they want to get through for this month. You might be losing a little bit of the big long-term EO there, but you're also trying to understand like what a perfect day could possibly look like for them now. Essentially what you're doing is you're asking, how can I get you through this month? And how can I tie it to something that you're motivated by? So that's pretty simple. Just kind of take the 3 wishes and then add this month to try to gleam out some really useful short-term or like more short-term than like a bigger value kind of conversation. But what we really need to be thinking about right now is we need the parents to feel like our sessions are actually helping them every time they tune in. I want us to be, I think as a community, we need to be really for them as a family unit and less about like, well, let's do, you know, some DTT. We need to teach you how to do DTT. At least this is my thought around it, and I think it's connected to a lot of what Espinosa is talking about if you're following any of that literature as well. I have this in my bibliography, so hopefully I can share this with everyone, or we can figure out a way to share this resource. But there's a really cool exercise for selfless context for parents that Hayes does on YouTube. I got it from an article. It was called like managing anxiety like a human during COVID-19 or something like that. Again, it's in my bibliography, but I think that is really important because parents are really navigating a whole lot of new rules about their identity. And there's this great article that just came out called From Helpless to Hero, Promoting Values-Based Behavior and Positive Family Interaction in the Midst of COVID-19. It's by the fabulous Tom Sabo, and he basically talks about the whole point is like, let's change the frame of this whole thing of feeling like we're helpless here and we're just thrown into this crazy situation to this is our time to be heroes as a family. So develop a set of family values, make some rules out of that, do some good behavior games around earning points for catching your child being good and working towards those values, and teach them that they can be a superhero right now. So by sending their friend a picture via text message or FaceTiming, they're being a hero because they're staying home and they're not, you know, spreading, they're doing their role as a hero in this situation. Or maybe they're helping mom out with the dishes and that's their time to be a superhero and to help out the family. So I have that as well in my bibliography, and I don't have time to really go into it in detail, but I think it's really great. It just came out like a few days ago, but I highly recommend you read that because we're all going to need to be equipped right now to navigate this experience, and it's new for everyone. So we're kind of all in this together. Yeah, here's my bibliography, and I'm open now for questions. If anybody has any.
Yeah, if you have questions, just, and you're able to turn on the mic, if not, you can put them in the chat box and I can facilitate that. Yeah, I do. I think one of the beautiful things, sorry, what was that?
Could you back up to the bibliography again?
Totally.
Perfect. I do want to say, like, you know, throughout, like, this kind of overlaps very nicely with some of the telehealth CEs that we've been having and presentations we've been having, because it's talking about flexibility and changing your treatment goals right now, and you have to do that. But I also think this is the perfect time. And remember that with everything that, you know, you're talking about here, there's a level of compassion that comes with this. And I think it's, you know, you go back to like where you were taking like the perspective relations and things like that. Like, just because you're saying you're sitting on your end from a computer and saying, you know, I think we should work on this, this, and this, and making sure that you're listening. And that's why that 3 wishes thing is just perfect. Cause it's like, all right, in this moment right now, like, what do you wish you could get through? What do you wish your life would look like right now? Like, is it, and being flexible with the rules that you have. Like yesterday, Kristen's son spent far too much time on video games, but it was like, hey, you know, what we did was he needs social interaction, so it's like, all right, you're gonna FaceTime a friend right now, and that's what you're gonna do. And it's flexibility because the whole world is shut down right now. You know, it's okay if you spend some more time on video games in this moment, right? Like, helping parents kind of, life will go on even if you backtrack just a little bit. Like, we'll come back from this. It's there's flexibility in that, and there's comfort once you can get them to see like it's okay. You know, yeah. There's comfort in that flexibility, I think. So
totally. And actually the Hayes exercise that I'm hoping you guys will be able to find, I'm 99% sure it's in my bibliography. But essentially what he's doing is he leads them through a kind of like a short guided meditation where they eventually get to the point of seeing themselves navigating this stress or looking at the stress from 10 years ago. And it's basically asking parents, what would you say to yourself if you were 10 years from now, watching yourself in the midst of all this? If you could send some words of wisdom to yourself, what would that be? And I think that's a really good self as context, because it's taking you from I here now and in the middle of the storm to me there then 10 years from now. And if you thought about this for yourselves, if you took a moment to try to think about that personally, you'd see that you have a lot of compassion for past you. And I do this exercise with kids too. I have them like write letters to their past. Is really loving. And I think this isn't ABA terminology, but we need to have a lot of compassion for ourselves right now. And I think parents need to be able to work towards their values, but also just understand that like none of this will be perfect. So yeah, I think that's a really.
For those of you that were at the Fort Lauderdale ACT boot camp, Jonathan and Kristen were on stage, and Jonathan did this really powerful, and I was in tears at the end, but everybody was in tears, I think. But it had you visualize a kid, and it was like if you have a kid, or if there's like your favorite kid or something like that. And well, first you had to think about the things, like the negative things that you say to yourself. So those rules, or the like self-deprecating statements that we say. And then we had to have that beautiful child say those things, or us say that to them. And it was like, you could never say that to them, you know? And it's like, you picture your kid and it's like, people are just crying. And it's like to switch roles and to have people say things like they would say to themselves, say to like this beautiful child. You know, you would never say that. And it really was, it was absolutely incredible. And I don't know if I'm not obviously not doing it justice, but I think parents, like you're talking about compassion right now. And that's something that we all need, right? Every single one of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And pay attention to your private events right now, personally, like what thoughts you're having as you're trying to navigate this change and how we're doing everything. And just try to practice diffusion for yourself. So if you notice you're like, I can't do this, parent training on telehealth's too hard, I'm not going to be able to make this happen, or this is so awkward, I hate it, just notice those thoughts. And then remember what your values are, which you're all here today for a reason. So you definitely have strong values. That's not even a concern. So just like bring yourself back to that and practice self-love. And I think we can get through this.
I think so too. Oh, one other thing, you mentioned Evelyn and parent training. Evelyn does this, if you've ever taken a training with her, she does this beautiful thing of where she will acknowledge what she's thinking or feeling. And she'll say, I'm noticing that I'm feeling very anxious, or I notice that I'm having this thought that this, and this. And I imagine her doing that with parents. And what a great model that is for noticing that something is coming up. Like, I'm noticing I'm having this thought. I'm noticing that I really don't want to do this tolerance training because X, Y, and Z. And I'm just noticing that, and it's great. And then I can just let it go, you know? Mm-hmm. It's not always that easy, don't get me wrong, because this is a very simplistic, like a lot of our parents could be potentially dealing with trauma related things, very severe behaviors, that a lot of this stuff is, when you say that to them, they're going to be like, you need to shut up, because it is not that serious, you know? So I think there's a level that this gets to where to a certain degree, they're going to look at us and say it's not that simple, and that's fine. But I think you need to recognize the level of what you're saying and not placate or not downplay what they're thinking or feeling. Often I've heard of people applying ACT, and that's almost what it does, is like, oh, it's not that, you just need to accept that it's hard and then move forward. That's not what this is at all. And don't think that it's just that simple. So
totally. And actually what you're talking about is modeling that vulnerability. And when you do it, I think, and this is something that ACT really pushes a lot, and I'm actually in a DNAV course, like a course with Evelyn right now, and we talked about this. And something she said was like, just check the function of when you're self-disclosing. So if you're sharing a part of yourself and wanting to relate, before you say it, just wonder what the function is. Like, am I doing this because it could help them to see that this happens to everybody and that could help them? Or am I doing this because I want to share about myself? And like, that's okay if you have that tendency. I always want to share about myself, and I have to check myself constantly. So just like before you self-disclose, a good thing is just to be like, okay, what will this do if I share? What's the point? Is this going to help, or is this just going to make them feel like I'm downplaying all of their situation right now?
Right. Exactly. Did anybody have any questions? I don't think I saw any. I think people are planning to go to the ACT bootcamp. Definitely become a member of ACBS. I would recommend that for sure. And from my understanding, it's like a values-based membership too.
Yeah.
So it's not any sort of crazy thing like, Kimberly, it's values based. I don't know if there's zero, if you can choose zero, like if you can't afford it, or if it's even $1 or what that is. But it gets you free access to the the Journal of Contextual Behavior Sciences, which is just absolutely amazing. So.
Totally. Can I answer Gloria's question really quickly?
Yes, I was about ready to draw your attention to that.
Okay. Yeah. So I think if parents don't have time to do the exercises, I think at the very core of what you want to focus on is where their values are. What's their EO? So if you can at least assess when you're just use your time for parent training, whatever time you have already allotted, use it to do that. You can even send them an email. Often I transmit this information depending on the parent. So if I have a parent who's really sensitive, I might allow them to read the questions and fill it out before we meet. But if I have a parent who's more open to being vulnerable in front of me, we can do it together. So I think now you could just assess where their values are, model a lot of that self-compassion and forgiveness and vulnerability with them in a way that's appropriate, and just use that. I think if you don't have time to lead them through exercises, the most important thing is just understanding where their values are, and then tie that into your parent training goals, and make sure you use some kind of specific verbal praise with them when you catch them working towards their values, because they might not even notice it, you know? Again, rule governed behavior makes us insensitive to some of those contingencies. So if you catch them, you can say, wow, I know that, you know, child autonomy is so important to you, and I can totally see you doing that right now. That's awesome. I hope that it kind of answers your question. The ACT podcast is in the bibliography, Nicole. It's Getting Your Act Together with Jonathan Tarbox.
You mentioned a YouTube video, I think it was by Hayes. Where can we find that?
So I'm sorry, I thought it was in my bibliography. I think it's on one of the ACT Facebook pages, but I know that the title was something along the lines of Managing Anxiety Like a Human. And then you just search ACT. There's a whole page. If I can send it to Erin, maybe she can send it out to you guys later, because I don't have it in front of me, but I know I've emailed it to a couple of the parents that I'm consulting with as a resource. So I can try and get that out to you. It may just not be right now.
That would be great. Thank you.
Cool. All right, cool. Well, if nobody has any other questions, I just want to really thank you for allowing me this opportunity. It's been super cool.
You're welcome. Thank you all so much. I'll get the follow-up email out to everybody. I'm going to send them the ACT article from Evelyn that you had talked about in the protocol too, and all that stuff. So
Awesome.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. I'm going to post this on the website too, so everybody have access to it. All right, everybody have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.